We're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning, once again, Tom Carpenter, who is Executive Director of Hanford Challenge. Start out, if you would. You formerly worked at the Government Accountability Project, and now you are the Executive Director of Hanford Challenge. Tell us about Hanford Challenge.
Sure. As you note, I worked at GAP, or Government Accountability Project. I was the nuclear program coordinator there. And in that job, we did look at Hanford already. So I've been looking at Hanford since 1985. Over time, Hanford became a more and more important issue compared to Los Alamos, Rocky Flats, and some of the other issues out there. So in 1992, we ended up setting up an office here in Washington, in Seattle, just to pay more attention to Hanford. But I kept Rocky Flats and Los Alamos and those other sites throughout the whole nuclear weapons complex as part of my job and responsibility. And we just got deeper into it. And so after a while, it became obvious that Hanford was a full-time job. And as we got to know it more, as we represented more and more whistleblowers and workers, then it's a unique strategy for cleaning up this site, which is a former plutonium facility in eastern Washington, that we needed different strategies than simply representing whistleblowers. So that's the birth of Hanford Challenge. And the main organization, Government Accountability Project, is very enthusiastic and supportive of the move to break off and do this this new organization. They've done it in other ways, with climate change and safe food organizations, et cetera, where we've really developed an expertise and gotten deep into something. And we felt we could make a new kind of difference with a new kind of strategy.
So what makes Hanford Challenge different than other existing organizations that are out there?
Well, our key strategy is and has been and will remain working with workers and whistleblowers and others who are at the site. There's over 10,000 employees who work at the Hanford nuclear site, and many of them encounter on a day-to-day basis radioactive and chemical hazards, and sometimes they're not well protected. Sometimes there's waste, fraud, and abuse that goes on with $2 billion a year of taxpayer money going into the site. Hanford is the largest toxic nightmare in the United States because of 50 years of plutonium production for nuclear weapons. They had 9 reactors operating. They had 5 major reprocessing facilities where they melted nuclear fuel with acid and teased out the plutonium and made enough plutonium for literally tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. And because the plutonium is a very small part of the radioactive fuel elements, then we have the other part at the site, and that represents an ocean of contamination below the site, in the ground or in tanks, and a lot of that has escaped into the Columbia River. So you can imagine that this would be expensive to try to clean up, and that shortcuts would be taken, shortcuts that would result in people getting hurt, shortcuts that would result in environmental contamination that the government would rather you not know about. And then there's the long range, how clean is clean and whether or not this is going to be taken care of. And it turns out that the workers and the whistleblowers on the site are our best source of information for when something is going wrong, when something's not being done very well, when people are getting hurt, things are getting covered over, literally sometimes in the ground. It is those workers who see that happening first. And when they speak out, we all win. We know what's happening. We can inform Congress about it, the news media, the public, and get some corrective action. So the struggle at Hanford has been over these many years, helping these workers come forward with information and protecting their jobs. And that's been a real struggle because the messenger was often made a victim out there. They were killed and they lost their jobs, and we had to litigate on their behalf. And we've had many dozens and dozens of legal cases filed at the Hanford site over the years. And that didn't result in people getting their jobs back. It did result in getting them settlements and money and maybe a new career path, but it was not a way to protect the source of information. So we started looking for other ways to achieve this result and actually change that culture to focus on the issue and not on the messenger. And that really, we did that with the help of University of Washington, which established a council for resolving employee concerns through Government Accountability Project, and then later Hanford Challenge, and the contractors and the government. We set up a council that could work with employees who blew the whistle and protect that person from retaliation and work with the companies to fix the problem. And the council ended up having authority to stop a person from being terminated or discriminated against or harassed. So the companies gave up a lot of their authorities in order to get the problems fixed and to prevent the litigation from happening, because that was causing them a lot of heartburn, time and money, embarrassment. Contractors would sometimes lose their contracts, so they weren't winning from that strategy either. But the council was a good method. So when I saw that happening, I saw for the first time senior managers exposed to true information about what was happening in the field. It wasn't filtered through lawyers. It wasn't, subject to assumptions about, oh, those guys just have an agenda. But seeing the heartfelt concern on the workers' face, really, and seeing firsthand how they were hurt. And changes started to happen from that at the upper levels of management. And that started me thinking, wow, we might have found a strategy here that's going to be different from our usual methods to create some change at the Hanford site. So that led to Hanford Challenge in a way, is where else can we find these kind of edges? Yes, we're going to have to litigate. Yes, we're going to continue working on legislation. We're going to educate the public. We're going to tell the truth about what's going on out there and always keep authentic. And we're going to find ways, to problem solve as inside players out there. And that's different from the usual approach of other groups, I think, is taking that authenticity of whistleblowers and workers and putting that information to work for some positive change.
So you have potentially 10,000 pairs of eyes and ears on the ground there. So what are the problems that they are seeing right now?
Well, Hanford is a mess. We have not benefited from the Bush administration's oversight of the cleanup. They put in place early in the administration something called accelerated cleanup of the Hanford site. So cleanup that was going to take 50 to 100 years, suddenly they were trying to compact into a 20-year period and save money doing it. Well, okay, look behind the curtain on that one, and what you find is they're not planning to do a lot of cleanup. They weren't planning to go after the groundwater contamination. Well, Hanford has 200 square miles of contaminated groundwater below the site there, and that is spreading over time because the contaminants in the soil are leaking at a constant rate into the groundwater. There's actually a slowdown in cleaning up some of the worst at Hanford, which is the waste, high-level nuclear waste in these underground tanks. So Hanford has 177 million-gallon tanks buried beneath the soil, and these tanks were the recipient of some of the high-level radioactive waste that came from the reprocessing of nuclear fuel. This is probably the most dangerous stuff on the planet ever. Very, very small quantities of this waste. And it's been said that a Dixie cup full of this waste in a crowded restaurant, everyone would be dead in the restaurant inside of an hour. Even the amount that would fit on the leg of a fruit fly is considered a problem dose. And that's happened at Hanford. Fruit flies have landed on contaminated materials and then flown off to go to the lunchroom and deposit contamination on food and on tables and whatnot. And they've had to evacuate a 20-acre area at the Hanford site because of hot fruit flies and wasps. So this waste in these tanks is very dangerous in small quantities. And it has another feature, which is it's dangerous for very, very long periods of time. And the great bulk of it is dangerous for hundreds of years by volume, but it doesn't matter because the volumes are so huge, 55 million gallons in these tanks. So even if you have 5 pounds of plutonium, that stuff is dangerous for 250,000 years. Some elements are dangerous for millions of years. So you've got a situation where you have to take these wastes and somehow keep them away from the living environment for many years. And the plan is to pump these tanks out. They were never meant to hold waste for very long, and yet they're now being used as permanent repositories practically. So there has been no plan B for getting the waste out of the tanks. Now there is a facility being constructed next to the tanks called a glass plant or a vitrification facility, but that's not going to open now until 2019. And the tanks probably aren't going to last that long. Some of those tanks will likely fail between now and then. So Hanford's between a rock and a hard place. And if they hurry up and try to get waste out of the leaky tanks, what's happened is last year they had a spill of 100 gallons of nuclear waste onto the soil at Hanford because a pump failed. The hot waste went up a fresh water line, spilled out onto the ground. Amazingly, Hanford officials didn't notice for over 12 hours that this had happened, even though it was a very high radiation area. There were, chemical vapors emanating from these wastes. They didn't have an industrial hygienist present to measure chemicals. So the workers who were nearby this waste, they were getting, exposures, and nobody knew it. And nobody knows what they got exposed to, and now a lot of them are very sick. So this is kind of a typical, day in the life of Hanford. It's not like that every day, but in the course of a year, you've got numerous events where people are exposed to, radioactive cesium or chemicals. Stuff is going into the river at a constant rate. Carbon tetrachloride is buried in some of the grounds out there, and it's just beyond belief, really, how complicated and maddening this cleanup is. So workers are again, they're in contact with this stuff on a constant basis and need that good protection for their own health and safety, but also to be able to talk about some of the concerns about the environmental contamination going on or the shortcuts that are being taken. So those are the kind of things that we're looking at.
So of those 177 tanks, how many of those were actually built back during the Second World War when they created Hanford?
Most of them, or shortly after. So most of the tanks date to the 40s and 50s. 129 of those tanks, they're single shell tanks. They're made of concrete and carbon steel. The reason they use carbon steel, which is subject to rusting, is they didn't have enough stainless steel at the time when they first built these tanks because of the shortage from the war. They built another series of double shell tanks in the 1970s, and they again used carbon steel simply because that's what the other tanks were made of. And it didn't make any sense to us, but that's what they decided to do. So now all these tanks have rust problems and corrosion. Many of them have big cracks in the concrete. They're below ground, so you really can't really see them. And a third of these tanks have been acknowledged to be leakers. So they've leaked 1 million gallons into the soil already. So the good news is there's 55 million gallons that hasn't leaked out. But 1 million gallons in the soil and heading toward the groundwater in the river is very bad news. That needs to be dealt with. You cannot turn your back on that issue. So that obviously is going to be an expensive problem to go after that waste. I don't see any plan on the books right now to go after that waste. So there's no plan, there's no budget or anything else. In fact, the new budget just put out by the Bush administration for the cleanup of Hanford falls $500 million short of what is required by the agreements for cleaning up the site called the Tri-Party Agreement to bring the site into compliance. So the Bush administration obviously has a war or two to pay for, and they're cheaping out on protecting public health and safety at the Hanford site. And they, at this point, intend to empty one tank per year. Now, do the math, 170 tanks left to go to empty out. We're talking, 100, several, over 100 years to empty out the tanks at Hanford. No way. No way will those tanks last that long. One small earthquake out there could spell disaster for this region.
I think you said the Hanford was getting for cleanup $2 billion a year.
Yes.
And I think that's what we spend per day on the war in Iraq.
Yeah, that's about right. We like to say that they spend that by breakfast in Iraq. But it's a lot of money by anyone's standard, and compared to what the government has, it's obviously we've got other problems in this country too that need attention, healthcare and renewable energy and global warming, et cetera. These are all issues that need attention. I would argue that Hanford, however, has very serious potential short-term consequences for our health and safety here in Seattle and in the region, as well as very dangerous long-term consequences for people in this area, in this region, for the foreseeable future, for hundreds of generations, simply because this stuff is so dangerous for so long. One of the areas that we're concerned about is, I mentioned this glass plant. The idea is to mix high-level nuclear waste with glass, molten glass, in this big facility. It's an expensive, complicated mess, but nonetheless, it's a good idea overall. The glass cools down, hardens, and hopefully retains its form for several thousand years. And then you can bury that glass in a deep geological repository. So if the glass fails, or when it fails, the waste won't have very far to go. It'll just more or less stay in the same place. So that's the plan. The glass plant itself is a nuclear facility because it's high temperatures, because it's dealing with very radioactive materials in very large quantities. So early on, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission got involved in overseeing the construction of this plant. And they were quite shocked at the lack of rigor for the design and the safety problems. And they did a report when they left in 2002 that estimated the current design that you've got for this glass plant carries with it a risk of catastrophic nuclear failure of 50-50 and 28 years of operation. So a 1 in 2 chance of a catastrophic nuclear accident delivering what they characterized as 24,000 rem to the border. Now, Chernobyl put out 600 rem as a maximum dose to the public. So, a factor of 12 or something? Just amazing amounts of radiation that would certainly cause parts of a 3-state area to be off limits for human habitation. We're talking about a site that's has a Columbia River flowing right through the middle of it. They use that river for cooling the reactors and for a source of clean, cold water. And this river is at risk and has been at risk from the Hanford site for some time. So we've been trying to get the facility to acknowledge the NRC report and the design failures. And for some reason, it's just not on anyone's radar screen. So our methods now are trying to get Congress to get the NRC back in here to say this plant can't open until you've got NRC approval to say it's good to go. Because the Department of Energy, which is the federal agency that owns and manages the Hanford site right now, they're the owner of the site. Obviously, they're trying to get things done, and I don't think they know what they're doing when it comes to nuclear safety issues. So, again, you've got a lot of things to watch out for the future as well as for the present time. And when it talks about Hanford, and people don't know much about it. That's really one concern that I have, is that people in Seattle and whatnot, some folks know that there's a site out there and they say, well, it's in cleanup mode, it must be going okay. Well, the news is it's not going okay. Things are kind of failing right and left, and we need to pull the communities together that care about the outcome of this cleanup. And there's a lot of them, including in the Tri-Cities, and get on the same page as to where we're going with this cleanup. And that's what one thing that we're trying to do at Hanford Challenge is take it away from this is a government problem, or this is a Tri-Cities problem in Richland, where the Hanford site is. Instead, this is a regional issue. This is a national problem, and a lot of communities care about the outcome of what happens here. And we need to coordinate our efforts to make sure the cleanup gets on the right track and happens.
What's the company in charge of building the vitrification plant?
It's Bechtel. The Bechtel Hanford company, it's actually Bechtel National. And unfortunately, it's the same company that did the Big Dig, which had the tunnel failures, and where the concrete pad came crashing down on this poor woman's car and killed her. And it turned out that there were massive quality assurance shortcuts. And I think Bechtel is capable of building a good plant, but only if they're subject to oversight and not self-regulating. And I think that was part of the problem with the Big Dig, and I think that's part of the problem at Hanford is nobody works very well under self-regulation, and they could do a better job on quality assurance. There was a survey done by the Department of Energy actually a couple of years ago of employees at Bechtel, and they found that over 70% answered in the survey that they would not raise a safety concern because they would be fearful of retaliation. Now, generally in these surveys, you might get 1 or 2% of the people saying that, and that would be cause for concern. 7 out of 10 employees, wow, that was a real shocker. And again, that would cause the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to simply shut down operations and say, you fix this, because employees are considered the front line of safety reporting, even for the federal agencies. And Bechtel and DOE basically shrugged it off. I mean, there were some efforts taken to fix that. Were they sufficient? I don't know. I do know that the person who did the employee concerns report was removed from their job and no longer does employee concerns at the Hanford site. So I think that's kind of what happens out there too often is the bearer of bad news is made the victim.
What leverage does the state of Washington have in this issue? I know you mentioned earlier the tri-party agreement.
Right. Well, the state of Washington had little to do with Hanford simply because the federal government would not let it until 1987, 88, when there was a change in the law. It used to be that states could not regulate a federal facility under the environmental laws because of the radioactive materials present at the site. It was considered that to be the sole domain of the federal government. And then a federal judge in Tennessee made a ruling saying, well, actually, if chemicals are mixed with radiation, it doesn't matter. It doesn't make those chemicals off limits to regulation, and states can regulate those chemicals, but not the radiation. And so that gave the states newfound authority to have a regulatory role at places like the Hanford site. Now, this waste is called mixed waste, and it just refers to the fact that there's a mixture of waste there of chemicals and radioactive materials. So the state of Washington has jurisdiction at the Hanford site insofar as there are chemicals present. Well, there's a lot of chemicals present, so they've got a role. That role started in 1989 with a contract, basically, that's called the Tri-Party Agreement that sets milestones for the cleanup of the site. And in the original iteration of that, we were supposed to have a glass plant to vitrify waste in the 1990s. That didn't happen, and they had to renegotiate the Tri-Party Agreement and said, okay, well, we'll have it by 2000. That didn't happen, and so then it was supposed to be 2007 and then 2009. So it's been always putting this thing off because of design failures, and this is the 4th attempt, for instance, to build a glass plant at the Hanford site, and many billions of dollars by the wayside have been wasted. So now the Tri-Party Agreement is under threat again because the deadlines have just been busted. There's no way the Department of Energy can be in compliance with the Tri-Party Agreement, yet they've signed on to it. And so there's been almost a year of renegotiation going on with the Tri-Party Agreement with the state of Washington and the Environmental Protection Agency, but all the news is bad. So it looks like we're heading toward court, and Christine Gregoire is threatening to take them to court and have the court impose a new set of deadlines, since the Department of Energy is being intractable and unreasonable and won't negotiate. And they say, we just don't have the money.
So talk about the waste tanks. Is it, since it sounds like the vitrification plant won't come online in time, do we just build some more waste tanks and transfer the materials over to that?
That's the discussion going on right now is how much time do we have before these tanks start giving out? And the scenarios are more leaks or even a dome collapse. The top of the tank just caves in. And these are scenarios that can happen simply because it's old age and it's time, just like the bridge in Minnesota, right? Or because of an event that triggers it, like an earthquake. And we've found out that there are earthquake faults out there that can cause, quite a considerable amount of ground motion that wasn't acknowledged in the past when they designed these tanks. Plus, the tanks are old, so they, they're not as young as they used to be and couldn't withstand it today. So we're all worried about that. I mean, when I say we, I think the Department of Energy and the contractors, the Tri-Cities, and we're looking at what is the plan B, since we're not going to have a glass plant online in 2011 like we thought. And now, that's been put off 2019 and maybe longer. We don't know. So, and then this new plan of let's empty one tank per year for 150 years, that's just crazy. So that has to be revisited. So it looks like new tanks may be on the horizon. I think that's a community decision. And when I say community, I mean, in Oregon and in Seattle and the larger community out here, what are our values? What are the risks we're willing to take on? And there needs to be discussion about, a path forward, but there is no discussion happening. So that's of real concern to us. And something that we want to see change is a greater discussion in the greater communities, and not just having decisions made in Washington, D.C. imposed, for, budgetary reasons because we don't have any money because of the war. That's not good enough for us. We've got long-term risks and short-term risks out here that need to be managed, and the federal government has some very dire responsibilities to protect the citizenry out here. And I liken it to the dikes in New Orleans. You cannot just fail to maintain the dikes. And at Hanford, you can't fail to maintain the Hanford waste tanks. And, the consequences are at least as great or greater for failing to do so.
Talking with Tom Carpenter. He is Executive Director of Hanford Challenge. And tell us how we can find out more about your group.
Right. Well, you can find out about us on the web at hanfordchallenge.org. So Hanford Challenge just being one word. And we picked that name simply because we think Hanford, that's what Hanford is. There's a lot of challenges associated with it. And we want to own some responsibility for how to take it on, and not just say, oh, federal government, go and fix it, because obviously they're not going to.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming in again and spending time with us.
Well, thanks, Mike. Always a pleasure to be here.